Frank Morrison's weathered hands froze on the tranquilizer gun, his coffee-stained thermos clattering to the muddy ground. The massive green anaconda, easily 28 feet of pure muscle, had the mother bear wrapped in its crushing coils, and her desperate cries echoed through the Amazon darkness like a mother's final prayer. This wasn't supposed to happen here. Sarah Chen's scream shattered the night air as she stumbled through the underbrush, her research clipboard forgotten, watching two tiny cubs circle their dying mother in helpless terror. The veteran ranger's hands trembled, something that hadn't happened since Vietnam, as he raised the gun with surgical precision. 3 months ago, Frank had been counting down lonely days to retirement. Now he was staring at a mother fighting for her baby's lives, just like Martha used to fight for every breath during those final Alzheimer's years. "Take the shot, Frank!" Sarah's voice cracked with desperation. But what happened after they saved her would shock the world. Who could have predicted that wild gratitude would rewrite everything we thought we knew about love? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, Dr. Sarah Chen had arrived at the Amazon Research Station carrying nothing but 2 duffel bags and a heart full of ghosts. The remote facility, nestled 200 miles from the nearest Peruvian town, represented her last chance at finding meaning in a world that had stolen everything she loved. At 42, she carried herself like someone who had been holding her breath for 18 months. Ever since 5-year-old Emily had lost her battle with leukemia. The research station buzzed with the quiet desperation of underfunded science, climate change studies, wildlife behavioral analysis, ecosystem monitoring, all noble work that would cease in 6 months when the grant money dried up. Sarah threw herself into documenting spectacled bear populations with the fervor of someone running from memories. Every night, she fell asleep to Emily's favorite lullaby playing from her phone, the same song that had played during those final hospital vigils. Frank Morrison had been the station's security chief for only 2 months, but his presence felt as permanent as the ancient cecropia trees surrounding the compound. At 68, the retired park ranger possessed the weathered wisdom that comes from 4 decades of protecting things that couldn't protect themselves. His wife Martha had passed 3 years ago after a brutal 5-year fight with Alzheimer's, leaving Frank with an empty house in Montana and a desperate need to matter again. Son of a gun couldn't sit still if his life depended on it, Sarah had written to her sister about Frank. The Vietnam veteran treated the research station like his personal fortress, checking perimeter fences twice daily, monitoring wildlife cameras with military precision, and maintaining equipment with the care of someone who understood that small oversights could mean life or death in the wilderness. The Amazon had been Frank's salvation. Here, surrounded by howler monkeys and jaguar tracks, he could channel his protective instincts toward something bigger than his own grief. Martha had always said he was born to be a guardian angel. And in the dense green cathedral of the rainforest, Frank finally felt like he was living up to her faith in him. Neither Sarah nor Frank knew that 200 miles away, Dr. Marcus Webb was packing his research equipment with hands that shook from guilt rather than excitement. The 52-year-old corporate scientist had spent 3 years searching for redemption in test tubes and data sets, convinced that breakthrough research could somehow balance the cosmic scales that had been tipped the night he'd driven drunk and killed an 8-year-old girl named Jessica, his own daughter. Webb's assignment seemed straightforward: investigate reports of unusual animal behavior at remote research facilities. Biodyne Corporation paid him handsomely to identify commercially viable discoveries, but Webb's real motivation ran deeper than money. He believed that scientific breakthroughs could resurrect meaning from tragedy, that saving future lives might somehow honor the one he'd destroyed. As the 3 adults converged on the Amazon Research Station, drawn by grief, purpose and desperation, none of them suspected that a 6-year-old spectacled bear named Luna was about to teach them everything they thought they knew about family was wrong. The evening patrol had become Frank's sacred ritual, a vestige of military discipline that gave structure to days that might otherwise drift into Martha's memory. At 1847 hours, old habits died hard. He shouldered his rifle and began the familiar circuit around Sector 7, the dense forest quadrant where the research cameras had been malfunctioning for 3 days. Sarah had been after him to check the equipment, but something deeper than duty pulled him toward those shadowy trees. The Amazon at dusk possessed an otherworldly quality that reminded Frank of church services from his childhood, hushed, reverent, alive with unseen presence. Howler monkeys called across the canopy like a distant choir, while the air hung thick with the perfume of night-blooming flowers and the earthy musk of decomposing leaves. Martha would have loved this place, he thought, remembering how she used to drag him to nature documentaries even as Alzheimer's stole her words but left her wonder intact. The distress calls reached him before he reached Sector 7. High-pitched, desperate keening that cut through the jungle's evening symphony like broken glass. Frank's pace quickened, muscle memory from Vietnam kicking in as his hands automatically checked his equipment. 40 years ago, those same instincts had kept his squad alive in rice paddies half a world away. Tonight, they told him something was dying in the darkness ahead. "Jesus Christ Almighty," Frank whispered as his flashlight beam found the nightmare unfolding in a small clearing beside the stream. The anaconda was a monster, easily 28 feet of prehistoric muscle wrapped around a female spectacled bear in a death embrace. Frank had seen plenty of predator-prey encounters during his ranger years, but nothing approached the raw horror of watching this slow-motion execution. The snake's coils tightened with mechanical precision, each breath the bear managed becoming shallower than the last. 2 cubs, no bigger than house cats, circled their dying mother in helpless panic. Their plaintive cries pierced Frank's heart with surgical precision, reminding him of Martha's confused calls for help during her worst Alzheimer's episodes. The same desperate need, the same inability to understand why the world had become so cruel. Frank's radio crackled to life before he could key it. "Frank, you copy?" Sarah's voice carried the tension of someone who'd been listening to the same terrible sounds from the station. "Doc, you need to get down here now," Frank replied, never taking his eyes off the struggle. "Sector 7 clearing by the big Cecropia. Bring the medical kit and every tranquilizer dart we got." "What's happening?" "Mama Bear's fighting for her life and she's losing." Sarah's response came through broken static as she ran. "On my way." "Don't engage until I get there." But Frank was already moving, his mind cataloging options with the cold efficiency that had kept him alive in combat. The anaconda's head was positioned away from him, focused entirely on its suffocating grip. One clean shot with the tranquilizer gun might disorient it enough to loosen the coils. Might. The alternative was watching a mother die while her babies screamed. Sarah crashed through the underbrush 7 minutes later, her medical bag bouncing against her hip and her research tablet forgotten somewhere in the mud behind her. She took one look at the scene, and her face went white. "Oh God, how long has this been going on?" "Too long," Frank said grimly, raising the tranquilizer rifle with steady hands. "That snake's got to weigh 400 pounds easy. She can't hold out much longer." The female bear's struggles were weakening, her brown eyes growing glassy as oxygen deprivation took hold. One of the cubs, a little female with distinctive white markings around her ears, had stopped circling and now pressed herself against her mother's exposed head, as if trying to will life back into the fading body. "Frank, wait," Sarah said, her medical training warring with her emotional response. "If you hit the snake while it's constricted like that, the muscle relaxation could crush her completely. And if I don't, she dies anyway." Sarah's hands trembled as she assembled a longer-acting sedative. Emily had loved bears, had insisted on visiting the zoo's spectacled bear exhibit every time they went. The memory hit like a physical blow. Emily's small hand in hers, pointing excitedly at the bears playing in their enclosure, asking why they had circles around their eyes like they'd been crying. "There," Frank said suddenly. "It's adjusting its grip." The anaconda's head lifted slightly as it sought a better angle, and Frank's shot took it perfectly behind the skull. The massive snake jerked, its coils loosening just enough for the bear to draw a desperate breath. What happened next would haunt Frank's dreams and change everything they thought they knew about wild animals and gratitude. The tranquilizer took effect like divine intervention. The anaconda's grip loosened with mechanical precision, its massive coils unwinding as the sedative flooded its system. Frank didn't wait for a complete release. He grabbed a fallen branch thick as a baseball bat and began prying at the snake's body, working methodically to free the bear while Sarah prepared emergency medical supplies with shaking hands. "Come on, Mama," Frank muttered, his Vietnam medic training surfacing after 40 years. "Stay with us now." The female bear collapsed the moment she was freed, her chest barely rising and falling in irregular gasps. Sarah dropped to her knees in the mud, her hands moving over the bear's body with practiced efficiency, checking for broken ribs, internal bleeding, signs of crushing trauma. The animal's pulse was thready and weak, her breathing shallow and labored. "She's not getting enough oxygen," Sarah said, her voice tight with professional focus masking personal panic. "Frank, hold her head steady." What Sarah did next would have been unthinkable in any other circumstance. She positioned herself at the bear's muzzle, tilted the massive head back, and began mouth-to-snout resuscitation. Emily's pediatrician had taught her the technique for small children, never imagining she'd use it on a 200-pound wild animal in the Amazon rainforest. 1, 2, 3, breathe, Sarah counted, forcing air into lungs that had been compressed beyond capacity. "Come on, beautiful, your babies need you." The cubs pressed against their mother's still form, their small bodies trembling with exhaustion and trauma. The smaller male, Frank would later call him Coco for his dark chocolate fur, emitted soft, whimpering sounds that cut through the night air like accusations. His sister, distinguished by white ear markings that resembled teardrops, simply stared at Sarah with intelligent brown eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "There," Sarah gasped as the bear's chest suddenly expanded on its own. "There we go." The female's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy, but alive. She drew several deep, shuddering breaths before attempting to lift her head. Frank had seen enough injured animals to know the signs of severe trauma, the disorientation, the struggle to understand what had happened, the instinctive search for immediate threats. "Easy, girl," Frank said softly, keeping his voice low and non-threatening. "You're safe now. We got you." But instead of the expected reaction, fear, aggression, or flight, something extraordinary happened. The bear's eyes found Sarah's face and held there, studying her with an intensity that made Frank's skin prickle. There was intelligence in that gaze, a recognition that transcended species barriers and spoke to something deeper than animal instinct. "She knows," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her muddy cheeks. "She knows we saved her." The bear slowly turned her head toward her cubs, who immediately pressed against her, chirping and nuzzling with desperate relief. But even as she comforted them, her eyes kept returning to Sarah and Frank, as if trying to memorize their faces. "We need to get her back to the station," Sarah said, her medical mind reasserting itself. "Check for internal injuries, monitor for shock, make sure the cubs are okay." Frank expected the bear to resist when they approached with a makeshift stretcher fashioned from research equipment and emergency blankets. Wild animals, especially injured ones, typically fought human contact with every ounce of remaining strength. Instead, the female seemed to understand their intentions. She allowed them to help her onto the stretcher, even positioning herself to make their job easier. The trek back to the research station took nearly 2 hours, with Sarah and Frank taking turns carrying the stretcher while the cubs followed close behind. The little female, Sarah had already started thinking of her as Honey for her golden brown patches, seemed to have appointed herself as family navigator, occasionally darting ahead to scout the path before returning to walk alongside her mother's stretcher. "Doc," Frank said as they approached the station's perimeter, "in 40 years of working with wild animals, I ain't never seen nothing like this." The bear was conscious and alert by the time they reached the medical facility, a converted shipping container equipped with basic veterinary supplies. Sarah had expected a fight when they tried to move her inside, but the female bear followed them willingly, her cubs trailing behind like well-behaved children entering a hospital. "It's like she trusts us," Sarah murmured, running gentle hands over the bear's ribcage, checking for breaks. "This is impossible. Wild bears don't behave this way." Frank had positioned himself by the door, rifle ready in case maternal instincts overrode whatever strange calm had settled over their patient. But the female remained still throughout Sarah's examination, occasionally making soft huffing sounds that seemed more like communication attempts than expressions of distress. The cubs explored their new surroundings with cautious curiosity, staying close to their mother, but showing none of the terror that should have accompanied finding themselves in human captivity. Coco discovered a cardboard box in the corner and began investigating it with his tiny paws, while Honey sat pressed against her mother's side, watching Sarah's every movement with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. "Ribs are bruised but not broken," Sarah reported, relief evident in her voice. "Some tissue damage from the constriction, but nothing that won't heal. She's incredibly lucky." "Lucky hell," Frank said. "That snake should have killed her. By the time we got there, she'd been fighting for her life for at least 10 minutes. Most animals would have given up." Sarah looked up from her examination, meeting the bear's steady gaze. She couldn't give up. She had too much to live for. As if understanding, the female bear slowly reached out one massive paw and gently touched Sarah's arm. The gesture was unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably grateful, and unmistakably directed at the woman who had breathed life back into her lungs. That simple touch changed everything. The bear they would come to call Luna refused to leave. For 3 days, Sarah and Frank waited for maternal instincts to reassert themselves, for the wild to reclaim what belonged to it. Instead, Luna established herself as the research station's self-appointed guardian, creating a den beneath the main facility's raised foundation where she could monitor all approaches while keeping her cubs safe and close. "This ain't natural," Frank muttered on the 4th morning, watching Luna perform what had become her routine patrol of the compound's perimeter. "Bears don't adopt human territory. They sure as hell don't protect it." But Luna's behavior defied every textbook Sarah had ever studied. Each dawn, the female bear would emerge from her improvised den, gently nose her cubs toward the food and water Sarah had begun leaving outside, then begin a methodical circuit of the station's boundaries. She moved with purpose and intelligence, checking the same security points Frank monitored, investigating any unusual sounds or scents, and positioning herself between the facility and the deep forest from which danger might emerge. Sarah found herself setting her alarm earlier each morning just to watch Luna's routine. There was something almost ceremonial about the way the bear approached her self-imposed duties, a dignity that reminded Sarah painfully of Emily's bedtime rituals, the careful arrangement of stuffed animals, the specific order of goodnight kisses, the way her daughter had taken responsibility for things beyond her years. "She's choosing to stay," Sarah told Frank over coffee on the 5th morning. "This isn't confusion or injury. She's making a conscious decision." Frank's weathered hands wrapped around his mug as he considered this. Vietnam had taught him to trust instincts over explanations, and every instinct he possessed told him Luna was operating on a level of understanding that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness. Martha used to say animals have souls. Frank said quietly. I always figured that was just her soft heart talking. But watching Luna, damn if she ain't got something going on upstairs that science ain't figured out yet. The cubs, Honey and Coco, as Sarah and Frank had taken to calling them, seemed perfectly content with their unusual living situation. They played in the compound's open areas during the day, always under Luna's watchful eye, and had begun showing curious interest in human activities. Honey demonstrated particular fascination with Sarah's research equipment, often sitting motionless for hours watching data collection procedures with the focused attention of a graduate student. She's learning, Sarah observed, making notes in her behavioral journal. Not just adapting, actively learning. Look at how she positions herself to observe without interfering. That's sophisticated cognitive behavior. Coco, meanwhile, had developed an unlikely friendship with Frank. The little male would follow the older man during his maintenance rounds, mimicking Frank's careful inspection of fences and equipment with comical precision. When Frank knelt to examine a loose board, Coco would sit beside him and sniff the same spot, his small face serious with concentration. "Got myself a deputy," Frank chuckled, scratching behind Coco's ears with gentle fingers that had once diffused bombs and now dispensed grandfather-like affection. "Reminds me of my grandson Tommy. Same kind of curiosity, same way of watching everything I do." But it was Luna's interaction with Sarah that defied all rational explanation. Each evening, as Sarah settled into her research documentation, Luna would position herself just outside the lab window, close enough to make eye contact but far enough to respect boundaries. The bear seemed to understand that Sarah was working, and her presence felt less like observation than companionship. "It's like she knows I'm lonely," Sarah confided to her sister during one of their weekly satellite phone calls. "I know that sounds crazy, but she only comes around when I'm missing Emily the most." Sarah's sister, a practical nurse in Denver who had helped her through the worst of the grief, was characteristically direct. Maybe she's not the only one who needed rescuing. The truth of that observation became clear during Sarah's first major emotional breakdown since Luna's arrival. It happened on Emily's birthday, what would have been her 7th, when the weight of absence finally cracked through Sarah's professional composure. She found herself sobbing in the lab at 2 a.m., surrounded by research papers that suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the 6-year-old who would never blow out another candle. Luna appeared at the window within minutes, pressing her massive face against the glass with such deliberate intention that Sarah couldn't dismiss it as coincidence. The bear's eyes reflected the lab's fluorescent lighting, creating an almost ethereal glow that reminded Sarah of the nightlight in Emily's hospital room. "I can't do this anymore," Sarah whispered to the glass, her breath fogging the barrier between them. "I thought helping other animals might make losing her hurt less, but it just makes me miss her more." Luna made a sound then, not quite a growl, not quite a purr, that somehow conveyed understanding and comfort in equal measure. She remained at the window until Sarah's tears subsided, her presence both impossible and essential. By the second week, Luna had begun bringing gifts. Small offerings appeared outside Sarah's quarters each morning, perfectly ripe fruits, interesting stones, occasionally a colorful feather or unusual flower. Frank initially dismissed this as typical foraging behavior, but the selection and placement of items suggested intentionality that made him uncomfortable. "Bears don't leave presents," he said, examining a particularly beautiful orchid Luna had deposited beside Sarah's door. "They just don't." "Maybe this bear does," Sarah replied, carefully pressing the flower between the pages of her field journal. "Maybe Luna understands gratitude in ways we haven't considered." The orchid joined a growing collection of Luna's gifts that Sarah had begun preserving, a ritual that felt sacred and necessary in ways she couldn't articulate. Each item became a tiny anchor point in a life that had been drifting since Emily's death, evidence that something still found her worth remembering. Frank noticed other changes in Sarah as Luna's residency extended into its third week. The younger woman smiled more frequently, laughed at his terrible Vietnam-era jokes, and began eating regular meals instead of subsisting on coffee and granola bars. She moved through the compound with renewed purpose, her research notes reflecting the excitement of genuine discovery rather than the mechanical going-through motions that had characterized her first months. "You're getting your spark back," Frank observed one evening, as Sarah enthusiastically explained Luna's latest behavioral innovations. "Haven't seen you this fired up about anything since you got here." Sarah paused in her documentation, suddenly aware of the transformation herself. "She's teaching me things I never expected to learn, about resilience, about choosing trust over fear, about finding family in impossible places." The cubs, meanwhile, had become fixtures in the compound's daily operations. Honey had claimed a spot near the weather monitoring station, where she would sit perfectly still for hours, apparently fascinated by the equipment's subtle sounds and movements. Coco preferred the workshop area, where Frank's patient explanations of mechanical processes were received with rapt attention and occasional experimental pawing at tools. "These little ones are going to be something special," Frank predicted, watching Coco successfully manipulate a simple latch after observing Frank's demonstration. Smart as whips, both of them. Luna's raising herself some remarkable kids. But the idyllic routine faced its first serious challenge when Dr. Marcus Webb arrived unannounced on a humid Thursday afternoon, stepping from a chartered helicopter with corporate confidence and hidden desperation in equal measure. Sarah and Frank watched from the lab window as Webb surveyed the compound with calculating eyes, his gaze lingering on Luna's family with an intensity that made Frank's combat instincts prickle. "Company," Frank said grimly, automatically checking the location of his rifle. Luna's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The moment Webb's feet touched the ground, she positioned herself between the stranger and her cubs, her body language shifting from relaxed guardian to alert protector. Her ears flattened against her skull, and a low rumble emerged from deep in her chest, not quite a warning growl, but close enough to make Webb stop in his tracks. "Interesting," Webb murmured, pulling out a tablet to record observations. "Subject demonstrates immediate threat assessment and protective positioning, suggests advanced cognitive processing. Subject?" Sarah stepped outside, her protective instincts matching Luna's. "Her name is Luna, and she's not a research specimen." Webb's smile was professional and cold. "Dr. Chen, I presume. I'm Dr. Marcus Webb from Biodyne Corporation. We've been following your reports with great interest. This bear's behavioral patterns represent potentially groundbreaking advances in our understanding of interspecies emotional bonding." Frank joined them, positioning himself slightly ahead of Sarah in a stance that Webb's trained eye immediately recognized as protective. The older man's service history was evident in his bearing, and Webb filed that information away for future consideration. "We're not taking visitors right now," Frank said flatly. "Private research facility." "Actually," Webb replied, producing official-looking documents from his briefcase, "Biodyne holds consulting rights to any discoveries made using federal grant money, which, according to my records, includes the funding that keeps this station operational." The papers were legitimate, Sarah realized with sinking dread. Her grant applications had included standard language about corporate partnerships and intellectual property sharing, boilerplate text she'd signed without considering the implications. "What exactly do you want?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. Webb's eyes returned to Luna, who had gathered her cubs closer while maintaining her protective stance. "I want to understand how she does it. The emotional recognition, the apparent gratitude, the decision-making processes, that led her to integrate with human society. These behaviors could revolutionize our approach to animal psychology, with applications in therapy, conservation, even pharmaceutical development. "She's not a laboratory rat," Sarah said sharply. "Of course not," Webb agreed. "She's something far more valuable. She's proof that the barriers between human and animal consciousness are more permeable than we ever imagined. With the right research protocols, we could unlock secrets that benefit both species." Luna seemed to understand that she was the subject of this conversation. Her intelligent eyes moved between the three humans, reading tone and body language with unsettling accuracy. When Webb took a step closer to get a better view, Luna's warning rumble increased in volume, and both cubs immediately moved to positions behind their mother. "She doesn't like you," Frank observed with grim satisfaction. "Animals often resist initial contact with researchers," Webb replied. "It's perfectly normal." But Sarah could see that Luna's reaction went beyond normal animal wariness. The bear's assessment of Webb seemed immediate and absolute, as if she recognized something in him that the humans had missed. The same intuition that had led Luna to trust Sarah and Frank was now screaming warnings about this new arrival. As Webb set up his temporary equipment and began making preliminary observations, Sarah felt the careful peace they'd built over the past 3 weeks beginning to crack. Luna's anxiety was infectious, spreading to her cubs and creating an atmosphere of tension that permeated the entire compound. That night, for the first time since her recovery, Luna did not perform her evening patrol. Instead, she kept her family huddled beneath the station, her eyes fixed on Webb's temporary quarters with unwavering vigilance. Frank found Sarah in the lab well past midnight, staring at Webb's corporate documentation with growing dread. "We can't let him take her," Sarah said quietly. "Might not be up to us, Doc. He's got lawyers and corporate backing." "We've got good intentions and a federal grant that's about to expire." Sarah looked out the window toward Luna's hiding place, where amber eyes reflected the station's security lights like tiny flames in the darkness. "Then we better figure out something fast, because Luna saved our lives, and now it's our turn to save hers." The storm warning came at 0600 hours on Webb's 5th day at the station, crackling through the satellite radio with the bureaucratic monotone that made life-threatening weather sound like a minor inconvenience. Tropical Storm Patricia intensifying to Category 2 hurricane, sustained winds 105 mph. All Amazon research facilities advised to implement emergency protocols immediately. Frank had weathered enough storms to recognize the real threat in the meteorologist's careful language. Category 2 meant potential roof damage, power outages, and complete communication blackouts. In the Amazon, it meant being cut off from the outside world for days or weeks, with only whatever supplies and equipment they had on hand. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked, her hands already moving through emergency checklists with practiced efficiency. 6 hours, maybe 8 if we're lucky, Frank replied, studying the satellite images on Webb's more sophisticated equipment. "She's moving faster than predicted." Webb looked up from his observation notes, where he'd been documenting Luna's increasingly agitated behavior over the past 48 hours. This could provide excellent data on animal weather prediction capabilities. Luna's been showing clear signs of atmospheric sensitivity for days. "She's scared," Sarah snapped, her patience with Webb's clinical detachment finally fracturing. "Her cubs are scared. They can sense the pressure changes probably better than our instruments." Luna had indeed been displaying unusual behavior since Webb's arrival, but the approaching storm had amplified her anxiety to levels that made everyone nervous. She'd moved her cubs twice, seeking higher ground and more sheltered positions. Her evening patrols had become frantic circuits of the compound, and she'd taken to positioning herself directly between Webb and her family whenever the corporate scientist attempted observations. "We need to secure everything that can blow away and prep the backup generator," Frank said, falling back on military protocols that had served him through countless emergencies. Doc, you handle the research equipment. Webb, help me with the perimeter. But Webb was already packing his specialized recording devices with movements that seemed more like preparation for departure than storm preparation. Actually, I've arranged for extraction. Biodyne's helicopter will arrive within the hour to transport essential personnel and research subjects to our secure facility in Lima. Sarah's blood turned to ice water. Research subjects? Luna and her cubs, obviously. We can't risk losing such valuable specimens to a natural disaster. Our Lima facility has proper containment protocols and advanced research capabilities. Like hell, Frank said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone who'd made harder decisions in darker places. That bear's not going anywhere. Webb's corporate smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes, a desperation that spoke of personal stakes beyond professional interest. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Chen, you're letting emotional attachment cloud scientific judgment. Luna represents a breakthrough that could benefit countless species. We have a responsibility to preserve that opportunity. Our responsibility is to Luna, Sarah said firmly. She chose to stay here. She chose to trust us. We're not betraying that trust by shipping her off to some corporate laboratory. The helicopter's approaching rotors punctuated her words, growing louder until conversation became impossible. Through the lab window, Sarah watched Luna's family huddle closer together, the cubs pressing against their mother as the aircraft's downwash bent the surrounding trees into unnatural shapes. Webb's extraction team emerged from the helicopter with professional efficiency that spoke of extensive planning. At 3 technicians in Biodyne uniforms carried tranquilizer equipment and portable containment units sized for large mammals. Their team leader, a weathered woman in her 50s, approached Webb with tablet in hand. Dr. Webb, we need to move fast. Storms intensifying ahead of schedule. Lima's reporting touchdown in 4 hours maximum. Frank positioned himself between the Biodyne team and Luna's hiding place, his weathered hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. 40 years of protecting things that couldn't protect themselves had led to this moment, and he'd be damned if he'd fail now. You want the bear? You go through me, Frank said quietly. The team leader assessed Frank with professional interest, recognizing another veteran by stance and bearing alone. Sir, we don't want any trouble. We're just here to ensure valuable research animals survive the storm. Valuable research animals? Sarah repeated, her voice thick with disgust. Is that what Luna is to you? What her cubs are? Webb stepped forward, his corporate composure finally cracking to reveal the desperate man beneath. Dr. Chen, you don't understand. This research could save lives, children's lives. The pharmaceutical applications alone could revolutionize treatments for developmental disorders, autism, cognitive disabilities. Like your daughter had? Sarah asked quietly. The words hit Webb like a physical blow. His carefully maintained professional mask shattered completely, revealing raw grief and guilt that had been festering for years. How did you... Jessica Webb, age 8, died in a car accident 3 years ago. The driver was intoxicated. Sarah's voice remained steady, clinical. Biodyne's employee records are quite thorough when you know where to look. Frank glanced between them, understanding dawning in his eyes. Son, you were the driver. Webb's shoulders sagged as 3 years of carefully suppressed truth finally broke through. I'd been drinking at a company function. Jessica called, said she missed me, asked me to come home early. I should have called a cab, should have waited, should have done anything but get behind that wheel. The Biodyne team exchanged uncomfortable glances as their boss's composure disintegrated before their eyes. Storm winds began whipping through the compound, sending loose equipment clattering across the ground and forcing everyone to raise their voices. The research isn't for Biodyne, Webb continued, his voice breaking. It's for Jessica. If I can understand how emotional bonds form across species, maybe I can develop therapies that help other children like her, children with her condition." "What condition?" Sarah demanded. "Autism spectrum disorder. Severe. She had trouble forming connections, understanding emotions, reading social cues. But she loved animals. They were the only things that made sense to her." Tears streamed down Webb's face as wind-driven rain began pelting the compound. The night she died, she'd been drawing pictures of bears, said they looked sad, like they needed friends. Frank felt something shift in his chest, the same recognition he'd experienced when Luna first looked at him with those intelligent eyes. "Son, that don't give you the right to take Luna. But it might give me the chance to save children who remind me of Jessica every day," Webb sobbed. "Do you understand what it's like to live with that kind of guilt? To know that one moment of stupidity destroyed everything good in your life?" Sarah stepped closer, rain plastering her hair against her skull as the storm's leading edge reached them. "Yes, I do understand. Emily, my daughter, died of leukemia 18 months ago. I know what it feels like to lose the most important thing in your world." Webb's desperate eyes met hers. "Then you know why I need this research, why Luna could be the key to understanding connections that transcend normal human limitations. And you know why I can't let you take her," Sarah replied firmly. "Because she's not a laboratory specimen. She's a mother protecting her children just like we were mothers protecting ours. Taking her against her will won't honor Jessica's memory. It'll compound the tragedy." Luna chose that moment to emerge from her shelter, her massive form moving with fluid grace despite the increasing wind. She positioned herself squarely between the Biodyne team and her cubs, her intelligent eyes assessing the threat with startling clarity. "Look at her," Sarah said, raising her voice above the storm. "Really look at her. Does she look like something that belongs in a cage?" Webb followed Sarah's gaze, studying Luna with the same intensity he'd once reserved for his daughter's artwork. The bear's stance spoke of dignity, intelligence, and fierce maternal protection, qualities that reminded him painfully of Jessica's own quiet strength during her worst episodes. "The helicopter can't wait much longer," the team leader called out, checking her watch against the deteriorating weather conditions. "Decision time, Dr. Webb." Webb stared at Luna for a long moment, seeing Jessica's face in the bear's protective posture, remembering his daughter's tears when other children couldn't understand her gentle nature. The research opportunities represented everything he'd worked toward since the accident. Redemption through scientific breakthrough, meaning salvaged from meaningless tragedy. But Luna's eyes held the same wounded trust that Jessica had shown him during their last conversation, when she'd asked him to come home safely and he'd promised her he would. "Stand down," Webb said quietly. "Sir?" The team leader wasn't sure she'd heard correctly over the wind. "I said stand down. We're not taking the bear." The Biodyne team exchanged confused glances, but began packing their equipment with professional efficiency. Whatever Dr. Webb's reasons, they had their own safety to consider as the storm intensified around them. "But sir," the team leader tried one more time, "the research opportunities—" "Will still be here when the storm passes," Webb finished. "If Luna chooses to participate in studies, it'll be her choice, not ours." As the helicopter lifted off into the darkening sky, fighting crosswinds that spoke of Patricia's approaching fury, Frank clapped a weathered hand on Webb's shoulder. "You done the right thing, son. That's more than most men can say." Webb watched the aircraft disappear into the storm clouds, carrying with it 3 years of desperate planning and the last of his professional credibility with Biodyne Corporation. But for the first time since Jessica's death, the crushing weight of guilt felt slightly more bearable. Luna seemed to understand that the immediate threat had passed. She nudged her cubs back toward their shelter, but paused to look directly at Webb with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. The expression wasn't forgiveness. Bears didn't deal in human concepts of absolution, but it might have been the beginning of understanding. "Storm's going to be a bad one," Frank announced, studying the rapidly darkening sky. "We better get everyone secured before Patricia shows us what she's really made of." As they hurried to complete storm preparations, none of them realized that the real test of their bonds, human and animal alike, was still approaching through the gathering darkness. Hurricane Patricia struck with the merciless fury of nature unleashed. By midnight, winds exceeding 120 miles per hour turned the Amazon Research Station into a fortress under siege, with trees bending impossibly before snapping like matchsticks and debris becoming deadly projectiles in the howling darkness. The generator failed at 0230 hours, plunging them into a world of emergency lanterns and battery-powered radios that crackled with increasingly desperate weather updates. Frank had weathered storms in Vietnam that seemed like gentle breezes compared to Patricia's assault. The research station's reinforced structures groaned under atmospheric pressure that made his ears pop constantly, while rain drove horizontally through gaps in their defenses with the force of bullets. He moved through the compound, checking emergency supplies and structural integrity, his flashlight beam cutting through darkness so complete it felt solid. "How are Luna and the cubs?" Sarah called from the communications room, where she was trying to maintain contact with emergency services through equipment that functioned sporadically at best. "Safe as they can be," Frank replied, though he worried about the makeshift den Luna had established beneath the main building. The area was elevated enough to avoid flooding, but if the foundation shifted under the storm's pressure, the entire structure could collapse on the Bear family. Webb sat in the corner of the main lab, staring at his laptop screen where Jessica's last drawings were displayed. Crayon sketches of bears that now seemed prophetic. The corporate scientist had shed his professional demeanor entirely, revealing a broken father whose grief had driven him to the edge of the Amazon in search of redemption that might not exist. "I keep thinking about what she'd say if she could see this," Webb murmured, his voice barely audible above the storm. Jessica always said animals were better than people because they didn't pretend to be something they weren't. Sarah looked up from her radio equipment, studying Webb's face in the emergency lighting. The man who had threatened to take Luna away now seemed as fragile as his daughter's artwork, hollow-eyed and trembling with more than just cold. "Tell me about her," Sarah said, setting down her headset. "Tell me about Jessica." Webb's hands shook as he scrolled through photos on his laptop, a beautiful little girl with dark hair and serious eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. She was 8 when she died, but she understood things that most adults never figure out. The way she looked at the world, everything was either kind or unkind, no gray areas, no complicated motivations. Animals were kind, most people weren't. The storm's intensity increased impossibly, and Frank felt the building shudder under Patricia's assault. Through the lab window, lightning illuminated a landscape transformed into an alien world of horizontal rain and flying debris. But something else moved in that chaotic darkness, something large and purposeful that made Frank's blood run cold. "Sarah," Frank called urgently, pressing his face against the reinforced glass. "We got company." The anaconda emerged from the flooded forest like a nightmare made manifest, its massive body moving with terrifying grace through conditions that had reduced human activity to mere survival. But this wasn't the same snake they'd encountered weeks ago. This monster was larger, darker, and moved with the focused hunger of an apex predator that had been tracking prey for days. "Jesus Christ," Frank breathed. "That thing's got to be 30 feet long." Luna sensed the danger before any of the humans fully understood what they were seeing. Her warning calls cut through the storm's roar like air raid sirens, urgent and terrified in a way that raised primitive alarms in every person who heard them. The cubs' answering cries spoke of mortal terror. They had recognized their mother's enemy even through the chaos of the hurricane. "She's trying to get to them," Sarah realized, watching through the window as Luna fought against wind and debris to reach her cub's hiding place. "The flood's forcing the snake to higher ground, right where the cubs are sheltered." Frank grabbed his rifle, checking the tranquilizer load with hands made clumsy by emergency. But even as he prepared to venture into the storm, they all knew the terrible mathematics of the situation. The distance from the main building to Luna's den was less than 50 yards, but in hurricane conditions with zero visibility, it might as well have been 50 miles. "I can't make that shot in this wind," Frank said grimly. "Hell, I can barely see the den from here." Webb stood abruptly, his laptop clattering to the floor as Jessica's drawings scattered across the lab. "I'll go. I can reach them faster than anyone." "Like hell," Frank snapped. "You're not trained for this kind of operation." "I'm expendable," Webb replied with calm certainty. "You two have research to complete, people depending on you. I've got nothing left but guilt and a chance to do something right for once." Before anyone could stop him, Webb had grabbed an emergency flashlight and was moving toward the door with the desperate determination of a man who had found his moment of redemption. Sarah lunged after him, but he was already outside, swallowed immediately by Patricia's fury. The storm consumed Webb like a living thing, battering him with debris and wind that threatened to lift him off his feet with every step. He fought his way toward Luna's den using emergency rope guides Frank had installed, his flashlight beam revealing glimpses of a world gone mad, trees uprooted and flying through the air, the research compound's equipment scattered like toys, and everywhere the sound of destruction that made coherent thought nearly impossible. Luna was already in battle position when Webb reached the den, her massive form silhouetted against lightning that turned the world into stark black and white photographs. The anaconda had found the cub's hiding place and was methodically working its way into the confined space, its enormous head disappearing into darkness while its body remained exposed to attack. Webb's arrival distracted the snake for crucial seconds, giving Luna the opening she needed to lock her jaws around the anaconda's neck just behind its skull. But the snake was far larger than the one they'd fought before, and Luna's bite, while powerful, couldn't penetrate the thick muscle and cartilage that protected the predator's vital areas. The cubs' screams cut through the storm as their hiding place became a battleground between titans. Honey and Coco pressed themselves against the den's back wall, trapped between the fighting animals and the hurricane's fury. Their tiny voices raised in terror that spoke to every parental instinct Webb had ever possessed. "Get away from them!" Webb shouted, though his words were lost in the wind. He grabbed a fallen branch, thick as his arm, and began beating at the anaconda's exposed body, putting all his grief and rage and desperate need for redemption into blows that had no effect on the massive predator. Luna's strength was failing. The anaconda's body began to coil around her, seeking the same crushing grip that had nearly killed her weeks before. But this time, she had more to lose than just her own life. Her cubs were trapped in the den behind her, and retreat meant their certain death. In that moment of ultimate crisis, Luna made a choice that would haunt Webb for the rest of his life. Instead of continuing to fight a battle she couldn't win, the mother bear suddenly released her grip on the snake and threw herself backward into the den, using her own body to shield her cubs from the anaconda's striking head. The snake's fangs found Luna's shoulder and back, injecting venom designed to paralyze prey before consumption. Luna's pained roar mixed with her cubs' terrified cries and Patricia's howling wind to create a symphony of anguish that drove Webb to acts of desperate courage he'd never believed himself capable of. "No!" Webb screamed, abandoning the useless branch and throwing himself directly onto the anaconda's head. "Not again! I won't lose another family." His weight and position disrupted the snake's ability to maintain its grip, but also put him within striking distance of fangs that could inject enough venom to kill a man in minutes. Webb wrapped his arms around the massive head, using his body weight to keep the snake's mouth away from Luna and the cubs, knowing that he was probably sacrificing his life for animals he'd planned to exploit just hours before. Luna, already weakening from the venom, summoned the last of her strength for one final effort. She managed to drag herself and her cubs deeper into the den, creating precious distance between her family and the struggling predator. But the effort cost her everything. She collapsed against the den's back wall, her breathing becoming labored as the snake's toxins spread through her system. The anaconda, frustrated by Webb's interference and sensing easier prey elsewhere, finally released its grip and slithered away into the storm-lashed forest. Webb collapsed beside Luna, both of them breathing heavily as Patricia's fury continued to rage around them. In the emergency lighting's fading glow, Webb looked into Luna's eyes and saw the same peaceful acceptance he'd witnessed in Jessica's face during her final moments. The bear was dying, and they both knew it. "I'm sorry," Webb whispered, his hand gently touching Luna's massive paw. "I'm so sorry for everything." Luna's eyes remained fixed on her cubs, who pressed against her failing body with desperate love. Even in death, she was still protecting them, still choosing their welfare over her own survival. Dawn broke over a transformed landscape, revealing the full scope of Patricia's devastation. The Amazon research station looked like a war zone, trees down everywhere, equipment scattered across flooded ground, and debris hanging from every remaining structure like bizarre Christmas ornaments. But Frank and Sarah barely noticed the destruction as they fought their way through the aftermath toward Luna's den, carrying emergency medical supplies and prayers that felt increasingly desperate with each passing minute. They found Webb first, unconscious but breathing beside the den's entrance, his body bearing the cuts and bruises of his battle with the anaconda. But it was the scene inside the makeshift shelter that stopped their hearts completely. Luna lay motionless against the den's back wall, her massive chest rising and falling in irregular gasps that spoke of systemic failure. The anaconda's venom had done its work with ruthless efficiency, attacking her nervous system and shutting down vital functions one by one. Honey and Coco pressed against their mother's cooling body, their small voices raised in mourning calls that cut through the morning air like broken glass. "Is she?" Sarah couldn't finish the question. Frank knelt beside Luna, his weathered hands checking for vital signs with the gentle expertise of someone who had comforted dying soldiers in rice paddies half a world away. "She's alive, but barely. Pulse is weak and irregular. Breathing's getting shallower." Sarah's medical training warred with her emotional attachment as she assessed Luna's condition. The bear's pupils were dilated and unresponsive. Her muscle tone was deteriorating rapidly, and the puncture wounds on her shoulder and back showed signs of severe tissue necrosis around the injection sites. "The venom's attacking her central nervous system," Sarah said, her voice professionally steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Without anti-venom, which we don't have for this species of anaconda, she'll be gone within the hour." Webb stirred at the sound of voices, his consciousness returning to a reality that felt more like a nightmare. He struggled to sit up, wincing at injuries he couldn't remember receiving, and focused on Luna's still form with growing horror. "She saved them," Webb whispered, his voice hoarse from shouting over the storm. "She could have run, could have saved herself, but she stayed between that snake and her babies until the end." Frank looked up from his examination, something shifting in his expression as he processed Webb's words. "Son, what exactly happened out here?" Webb's account of Luna's final sacrifice emerged in broken fragments. How she had chosen to shield her cubs with her own body, how she had used the last of her strength to drag them to safety, how her eyes had remained fixed on Honey and Coco even as the venom paralyzed her system. She made the same choice any mother would make, Webb concluded, his voice breaking. The same choice I should have made for Jessica 3 years ago. Sarah knelt beside Luna's head, gently stroking the bear's fur while studying her eyes for any sign of awareness. Luna's gaze was unfocused now, but there was something in her expression that suggested she knew her human friends were present. It was the same look Emily had given Sarah during those final hospital hours, peaceful, grateful, ready to let go. "She knows we're here," Sarah said softly. "She knows her cubs are safe." The morning sun filtered through the storm-damaged canopy, creating patterns of light and shadow that reminded Frank of the church services Martha had loved so much. There was something sacred about this moment, something that transcended the boundary between human and animal grief. Webb pulled himself closer to Luna, ignoring his own injuries as he positioned himself where the dying bear could see him clearly. "Luna," he said quietly, "I want you to know that Honey and Coco will be safe. We'll take care of them, all of us together. They'll never be alone." To everyone's astonishment, Luna's eyes shifted slightly to focus on Webb's face. For a moment, the venom's paralysis seemed to retreat, allowing one final moment of connection between species. Her massive paw moved incrementally toward Webb's outstretched hand, and when their skin made contact, something passed between them that felt like forgiveness. "She understands," Frank said in wonder. "Damn if she don't understand every word." But even as they watched, Luna's breathing became more labored, and her eyes began to lose their focus. Sarah found herself thinking about Emily's final moments, how her daughter had squeezed her hand one last time before slipping away with a smile that suggested she could see something beautiful waiting for her. "Sing to her," Sarah said suddenly. "Emily always liked it when I sang during the hard times." Frank's voice, rough with age and emotion, began the opening lines of "Amazing Grace," the same hymn he'd sung at Martha's bedside during her final days. Webb joined in with a trembling tenor that spoke of church choirs from his childhood, while Sarah added her own voice to the improvised memorial service. Luna's breathing slowed during the second verse, each inhalation requiring more effort than the last. Honey and Coco seemed to understand that their mother was leaving them, their morning calls becoming softer, more accepting. They pressed closer against Luna's body, as if trying to absorb every last moment of warmth and comfort she could provide. "Wait," Frank said suddenly, his hand pressed against Luna's chest. Her heartbeat's getting stronger. Sarah checked Luna's pupils again, hardly daring to hope. The dilation's decreasing, muscle tones improving slightly. Webb looked up from where he'd been holding Luna's paw, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Is she fighting back?" What happened next defied every medical text Sarah had ever studied. Luna's breathing began to stabilize. Her pulse grew stronger and more regular, and the glassy look in her eyes gradually cleared. It wasn't a miraculous recovery. The bear was still critically injured and would need intensive care. But it was the impossible rally that sometimes occurred when patients had compelling reasons to live. "She's not ready to go," Frank said with quiet certainty. "Not while her cubs still need her." Over the following hours, Luna's condition continued to improve in ways that challenged scientific explanation. The venom's effects slowly retreated, allowing her nervous system to resume normal function. She remained weak and would require weeks of careful nursing, but the immediate threat of death had passed. Webb stayed beside Luna throughout her recovery, driven by guilt and gratitude in equal measure. He helped Sarah administer fluids and medications, monitored vital signs, and talked constantly to Luna about Jessica, how his daughter would have loved meeting such a remarkable mother, how she would have drawn pictures of Luna's family to add to her collection of bear artwork. "I think she knows about Jessica," Webb told Sarah during one of their bedside vigils. "Animals understand loss differently than we do. They don't get caught up in guilt and regret the way humans do." Frank, meanwhile, had taken charge of Honey and Coco, who remained anxious and confused about their mother's condition. The old veteran's patience with the cubs seemed limitless, and he spent hours teaching them simple games and showing them how to find food and water while Luna recovered. "These little ones are going to be fine," Frank assured Sarah as he watched Coco successfully manipulate a puzzle feeder. "They got their mama's intelligence and her heart. That's all any kid really needs." As Luna's strength gradually returned, so did her awareness of what had transpired during the storm. She seemed to remember Webb's intervention clearly, and her attitude toward the corporate scientist underwent a remarkable transformation. Where once there had been suspicion and hostility, now there was acceptance and something that might have been gratitude. "She's forgiven me," Webb observed with wonder as Luna allowed him to check her bandages without resistance. "I came here to exploit her, to take her children away from her, and she's forgiven me." Sarah looked up from her notes, where she'd been documenting Luna's recovery with the meticulous care of someone recording a miracle. "Maybe she understands that you're not the same person who arrived here a week ago." Webb considered this, thinking about the man he'd been before Patricia's storm, driven by guilt, obsessed with redemption through scientific achievement, willing to sacrifice Luna's welfare for abstract research goals. That person seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone who understood that some forms of healing couldn't be found in laboratories or corporate reports. "I'm resigning from Biodyne," Webb announced quietly, effective immediately. Frank looked up from where he was teaching Honey to retrieve fallen fruit. "What will you do?" Webb's answer came without hesitation, as if he'd been planning it for days rather than deciding in that moment. "Stay here, if you'll have me. Help with Luna's recovery. Contribute to the research in ways that honor her choice to trust us. Jessica would want me to protect families, not destroy them." Sarah felt something settle in her chest, a peace she hadn't experienced since Emily's death. The research station that had been facing closure now had new funding possibilities through Webb's contacts. Luna's family had proven that love transcended species boundaries, and 3 broken people had found healing in the most unlikely circumstances. As the sun set over the storm-damaged compound, Luna managed to stand for the first time since the anaconda attack. She was unsteady and required support, but her eyes held the same intelligent awareness that had first captivated Sarah weeks ago. Honey and Coco pressed against their mother's legs, chirping with joy at having her upright again. "She's going to make it," Sarah said, hardly believing the words as she spoke them. Frank nodded, his weathered face creased in a smile that reminded everyone present of grandfathers and gentle wisdom. "Course she is. Luna's got too much to live for to give up now." Webb watched the family reunion with tears in his eyes, seeing Jessica's face in the cub's joy and remembering his daughter's belief that animals were inherently good. For the first time since the accident, he felt worthy of Jessica's memory. But the greatest revelation was yet to come, hidden in the storm's aftermath and waiting to transform their understanding of loyalty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of family. 2 weeks after Hurricane Patricia's devastation, Sarah was conducting her morning equipment check when she heard the impossible sound, the distinctive chirping call of a young spectacled bear in distress. But Honey and Coco were playing safely near Luna's recovery shelter, their voices clearly audible from an entirely different direction. Sarah's heart stopped as the implications crashed over her like a cold wave. "Frank!" she called urgently into her radio. "Get to Sector 7 immediately. I think we have another cub." Frank's weathered boots were already moving before Sarah finished her transmission. 40 years of emergency response had taught him to trust impossible-sounding reports, especially when they came from someone as level-headed as Dr. Sarah Chen. He reached the storm-damaged clearing where they'd first encountered Luna 3 weeks ago to find Sarah standing frozen beside a massive fallen cecropia tree. Trapped beneath a tangle of branches and debris, weakened but very much alive, was a third cub, slightly smaller than Honey and Coco, with distinctive markings that left no doubt about its parentage. The little bear was crying with the desperate exhaustion of someone who had been calling for help far too long, its voice hoarse from days of unanswered pleas. "How is this possible?" Frank breathed, already moving to clear debris with practiced efficiency. "Luna only had 2 cubs. We've been watching them for weeks." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities as she helped lift branches that had pinned the cub in a natural shelter formed by the tree's massive root system. "Wait," she said suddenly, her hands stilling on a particularly heavy branch. "What if Luna didn't have 2 cubs? What if she had 3 and lost one earlier?" The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Luna's unusual behavior when they'd first encountered her, the way she'd searched the area after the anaconda attack, the distressed calls that had seemed excessive even for a mother protecting 2 cubs. She hadn't been just fighting for Honey and Coco. She'd been trying to protect 3 babies. And in the chaos of that night, one had become separated from the family. "This little one's been surviving on its own for 3 weeks, Sarah realized, gently extracting the weakened cub from its makeshift shelter. "Hiding in this debris pile, probably living on insects and whatever water it could find." The cub, Sarah mentally dubbed him Storm, was severely dehydrated and malnourished, but alert enough to respond to human touch with desperate gratitude. His small body trembled with exhaustion as Sarah wrapped him in her emergency blanket, but his eyes held the same intelligent awareness that characterized Luna's family. Frank's radio crackled to life as they began the trek back to the compound. "Frank, Sarah, where are you?" Webb's voice carried undertones of excitement that seemed inappropriate given their current situation. "Luna's acting strange again. She keeps looking towards Sector 7 and making sounds I've never heard before." "We're coming in," Frank replied grimly. "And we're bringing someone Luna's been missing." The reunion between Luna and her lost cub defied every scientific parameter Sarah had ever studied. The moment Luna caught Storm's scent, her entire body language transformed from recovery patient to fully activated mother. Despite her own weakness from the anaconda attack, she struggled to her feet and moved toward them with purpose that overrode physical limitations. Luna's examination of Storm was thorough and heartbreaking. She sniffed every inch of his small body, checking for injuries with gentle touches of her massive paws, making soft, huffing sounds that seemed designed to comfort and reassure. When she was satisfied that her missing baby was safe, she gathered all 3 cubs against her and began the deep, rumbling purr that spectacled bears use to soothe distressed young. Honey and Coco's reaction to their brother's return was immediate and joyful. They pressed against Storm with excited chirping sounds, grooming him and sharing body warmth as if trying to make up for 3 weeks of separation. The family dynamic that Sarah and Frank had observed was suddenly complete. Luna had never been protecting just 2 cubs. She'd been grieving the loss of a third while caring for the 2 she could save. "She never gave up hope," Sarah whispered, watching Luna carefully position Storm where she could keep constant contact while he nursed. "All this time she's been hoping he'd come home." Webb approached the family group with reverent caution. His understanding of Luna's previous behavior suddenly recalibrated. "That's why she stayed," he said with dawning comprehension. "She wasn't just showing gratitude for being rescued. She was hoping we'd help her find Storm." Frank studied Luna's face, seeing new depths in the intelligence he'd already learned to respect. "She's been trying to tell us for 3 weeks that someone was missing. We just weren't smart enough to understand." The implications of Storm's survival and reunion created ripples that extended far beyond the research station. Luna's story, a mother's refusal to abandon hope, her choice to trust humans who had proven themselves worthy of that trust, and the eventual restoration of her complete family, captured global attention in ways that corporate research never could. Within days, National Geographic was planning a documentary. Conservation organizations from around the world pledged funding to ensure the station's permanent operation. Children's book publishers competed for rights to Luna's story, understanding that her tale of maternal love and cross-species cooperation would resonate with readers of all ages. But for Sarah, Frank, and Webb, the most important changes were happening quietly within the compound's rebuilt boundaries. Storm's return had completed something that none of them fully understood until they witnessed it: the restoration of a family that had been broken but never abandoned. "I keep thinking about what this means," Webb confided to Sarah during one of their evening talks. "Luna could have left with Honey and Coco weeks ago. She could have started over somewhere safe. Instead, she stayed here, in the place where she'd lost Storm, because she believed we'd help her find him." Sarah looked across the compound to where Luna was teaching all 3 cubs to fish in the repaired water feature Frank had constructed. She understood something we're still learning: that family isn't just about who you're with, it's about who you refuse to leave behind. Frank joined them, carrying his evening coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose day had been filled with purposeful work. At 68, he'd found a second career that gave him more joy than 40 years of previous employment combined. "Those cubs are going to be something special," Frank observed, watching Storm's determined attempts to mimic his siblings' fishing techniques. 3 weeks on his own taught him things they'll never need to know, but he's sharing it all with them anyway. The integration wasn't without challenges. Storm remained smaller and more cautious than his siblings, his survival experience having taught him wariness that Honey and Coco had never needed to develop. But Luna's patient attention and his siblings' unconditional acceptance gradually restored the confidence that isolation had eroded. Webb's transformation proved equally remarkable. The corporate scientist who had arrived with plans to exploit Luna for research purposes now spent his days documenting her family's behaviors with the reverent attention of someone recording sacred rituals. His reports to former Biodyne colleagues read more like love letters than scientific observations. "I used to think healing meant fixing what was broken," Webb told Sarah as they watched Luna's cubs play in the afternoon sunlight. "But Luna's family isn't fixed. They're integrated. Storm will always be different because of what he survived. Luna will always bear scars from the anaconda attacks. But they're not broken. They're complete." Sarah felt the truth of Webb's observation resonate in her own heart. Emily's death had left scars that would never fully heal. But Luna's family had shown her that love didn't require the absence of pain. It required the choice to remain present despite the pain. The research station that had once faced closure now operated with secure funding and international recognition. Luna's story had attracted researchers, conservationists, and wildlife enthusiasts from around the world, all drawn by the possibility of witnessing the impossible bond between a bear family and the humans who had earned their trust. But the most profound change was invisible to outside observers. 3 broken people had found healing through service to a family that had taught them the true meaning of loyalty, sacrifice, and hope. In choosing to trust them with her most precious possessions, her children, Luna had given them something more valuable than any research breakthrough. She had given them the chance to be worthy of that trust. As evening settled over the Amazon compound, Luna gathered her complete family for their nightly rest, all 3 cubs pressed safely against her recovering body. Nearby, three humans who had found their own version of family in the most unlikely circumstances, settled into sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to prove themselves worthy of the faith a remarkable mother had placed in them. The story that had begun with rescue had become something far more profound, a testament to the power of love that transcends species, forgives past failures, and creates families from the most broken materials. Sometimes the most profound healing comes not from fixing what's broken, but from learning to love what remains. Luna's story reminds us that family isn't defined by blood alone. It's created through choice, nurtured by sacrifice, and sustained by unwavering loyalty. For those of us who've watched our children grow and leave, who've buried spouses after decades of shared dreams, who wonder if our best years are behind us, Luna offers a different truth. At any age, at any stage of loss, we can still choose to open our hearts to unexpected love. Sarah found purpose after losing Emily. Frank discovered meaning beyond Martha's memory. Webb learned that redemption isn't earned through achievement, but through service to something greater than ourselves. The empty nest doesn't have to mean an empty heart. Sometimes, like Luna teaching Storm to fish after weeks of separation, our greatest joy comes from welcoming back what we thought was lost forever. Whether that's hope, purpose, or simply the belief that tomorrow might hold something beautiful we never saw coming. Questions for reflection. What lost cub in your own life are you still hoping will find its way home? How has helping others heal your own heart in unexpected ways? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what another soul needs to hear today. 6 months after Hurricane Patricia, the Amazon Research Station had transformed into something none of its founders could have envisioned. What began as a struggling climate research facility now operated as the Luna Family Conservation Center, attracting visitors, researchers, and funding from around the world. But the most remarkable transformation wasn't in buildings or budgets. It was in the unlikely family that had formed between species and across the vast landscape of shared loss. Sarah Chen stood in the expanded observation deck, watching Luna guide her 3 cubs through their morning fishing lesson with the patient determination that had become her trademark. Storm, now nearly as large as his siblings, despite his rough start, showed particular aptitude for the complex techniques Luna demonstrated. His weeks of independent survival had taught him resourcefulness that complemented Honey's natural leadership abilities and Coco's irrepressible curiosity. "Hard to believe it's been half a year," Frank said, joining Sarah with his customary morning coffee. At 68, Frank had discovered that retirement didn't mean the end of meaningful work. It meant the beginning of work that truly mattered. His official title was Director of Animal Welfare, but his real job was serving as surrogate grandfather to Luna's cubs and guardian angel to everyone else at the facility. Webb emerged from the communications building, tablet in hand and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose morning had been productive. His transformation from corporate scientist to conservation advocate had been complete and irreversible. Biodyne Corporation had terminated his employment, sued him for breach of contract, and attempted to discredit his work, but Webb had found something worth more than corporate security. He had found redemption through service. The documentary premiered last night, Webb announced, his voice carrying excitement that reminded Sarah of Emily's Christmas mornings. National Geographic is reporting their highest viewership numbers in 5 years. Luna's story is reaching millions of people. The documentary, titled The Mother Who Chose Love, had captured global attention not just for its remarkable animal footage, but for its deeper message about healing, forgiveness, and the power of chosen family. Viewers around the world had connected with the parallel stories of Luna's maternal sacrifice and the 3 humans who had found purpose through protecting her family. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest as she thought about Emily watching the documentary from wherever children's spirits might dwell. Would her daughter be proud of the woman her mother had become? Would she understand that loving Luna's family didn't diminish the love that would always belong exclusively to Emily? The foundation received 15 new funding applications yesterday, Webb continued, scrolling through messages on his tablet. Wildlife refuges, rehabilitation centers, research facilities. Everyone wants to replicate what we've built here. Frank chuckled, a sound that had become increasingly common as the months passed. What we've built. Son, Luna built this. We just had the good sense to pay attention when she offered to teach us. The truth of Frank's observation had become the Foundation's guiding principle. Rather than studying Luna's family as research subjects, they had learned to observe and support natural behaviors that challenged conventional understanding of animal intelligence and emotion. Luna's cubs were developing skills and social bonds that would prepare them for eventual reintegration with wild populations, but they were doing so within the security of human protection that Luna had chosen to accept. Speaking of teaching, Sarah said, checking her watch, the school group arrives in 2 hours, 43 children from the Peruvian Rural Education Program. These visits had become Luna's favorite part of the routine. The bear seemed to understand that children posed no threat and often responded to their presence with behaviors she displayed nowhere else. She would position herself where young visitors could observe her family safely, sometimes appearing to pose for photographs or demonstrate specific skills when she sensed particularly engaged audiences. "She knows they're coming," Frank observed, pointing toward Luna's enclosure where the bear was already moving her cubs toward the viewing area despite the early hour. "Swear that animal can read our calendar." Webb looked up from his tablet, still amazed by Luna's apparent understanding of human schedules and intentions. Dr. Martinez from the University of Sao Paulo wants to study Luna's cognitive mapping abilities. She believes Luna has developed internal models of human behavior patterns that allow her to predict our activities. "More researchers," Sarah sighed, though not without affection. The constant stream of scientific interest in Luna's family had brought prestige and funding to the center, but it also required careful management to ensure that Luna's welfare remained the primary consideration. "This one's different," Webb assured her. "Dr. Martinez lost her own daughter to cancer 3 years ago. She understands our approach: observation without exploitation, learning without interference." The mention of another mother's loss sent ripples of recognition through the group. Over the months, they had discovered that Luna's story resonated most powerfully with people who had experienced profound grief and found their way back to hope. Parents who had lost children, spouses who had buried partners, elderly individuals facing their own mortality, all seemed to find something healing in Luna's choice to trust again after trauma. "The mail arrived," announced Dr. Emily Santos, the center's new education coordinator, as she approached with a canvas bag overflowing with letters. Dr. Santos had joined the team 3 months ago, drawn by Luna's story and her own need to find meaningful work after retiring from 30 years of elementary education in Lima. The Daily Mail had become a source of constant wonder. Letters arrived from around the world, children's drawings of Luna's family, poems from grieving parents, donations from elderly individuals who sent their grocery money because Luna's story had given them reason to hope again. Sarah had taken to reading selections aloud during their evening meals, sharing the global impact of one bear's choice to trust the humans who had saved her life. "This one's from Martha Henderson in Oregon," Dr. Santos said, selecting an envelope written in careful cursive. "She's 92 and lost her husband last winter. She says watching Luna care for her cubs reminds her that love doesn't end when life changes, it just finds new ways to express itself." Frank's eyes misted as Dr. Santos read Martha Henderson's letter, his own. Martha had been gone 3 years now, but watching Luna's maternal devotion had taught him that grief and joy could coexist, that protecting new life honored rather than betrayed the memory of those who had passed. "There's something else," Dr. Santos continued, her voice carrying unusual excitement. "The Smithsonian wants to feature Luna's story in their new exhibit on animal intelligence and emotion. They're offering to fund a permanent educational display here at the center." Webb looked up sharply. "What kind of display?" "Interactive exhibits about animal cognition, conservation success stories, and the human-animal bond. Nothing that would disturb Luna or require changes to her routine. Everything would be designed around observing her natural behaviors." Sarah felt a familiar mixture of pride and protectiveness. Luna's story deserved to be shared with the world, but only in ways that honored the bear's autonomy and dignity. Every decision had to pass the test of Emily's memory. Would this choice make the world more loving, more understanding, more protective of vulnerable creatures? "What does Luna think about all this attention?" Frank asked, only half joking. As if summoned by his question, Luna herself appeared at the edge of her family's enclosure, her cubs trailing behind in their customary formation. She looked directly at the group of humans, her intelligent eyes seeming to assess their conversation before making one of her characteristic huffing sounds that they had learned to interpret as gentle acknowledgement. "She thinks we're doing okay," Sarah said with certainty that surprised even her. "But she's reminding us that her cubs come first, always." Luna's maternal priorities had become the center's North Star. Every program, every visitor, every research opportunity was evaluated through the lens of what served Luna's family best. This approach had attracted rather than deterred serious scientists who recognized that the most authentic animal behavior emerged when subjects felt secure and respected. The morning school visit proceeded with Luna's usual gracious cooperation. 43 children from remote Peruvian villages watched in wonder as Luna demonstrated fishing techniques, grooming behaviors, and play activities with her cubs. Several children had prepared drawings to show Luna, holding their artwork against the observation windows with the serious reverence of offering gifts to royalty. "Mira, Mama Osa," whispered 7-year-old Carlos, pressing his crayon drawing of Luna's family against the glass. "Te dibujé con tus bebés." Luna approached the window where Carlos stood, studying his artwork with apparent interest before making soft sounds that the boy interpreted as approval. She then called her cubs forward, positioning them where Carlos could see their faces clearly, as if introducing her children to their young admirer. "She understands," Dr. Santos murmured to Sarah. "She knows that boy made something special just for her." These moments of connection between Luna and human visitors had become legendary among the center's staff. Children who arrived shy or frightened left with confidence and wonder. Adults who came carrying grief or loss departed with renewed hope. Luna seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of what each visitor needed, responding with behaviors that provided exactly the right combination of majesty and gentleness. As the school group departed, clutching their drawings and photographs with expressions of pure joy, Frank reflected on the miracle they witnessed daily. A wild bear had chosen to trust humans enough to share her family with the world, and in doing so, had created ripples of healing that extended far beyond the Amazon forest. 43 kids who will never forget this day, Frank said with satisfaction. 43 futures that Luna just made a little bit brighter. Sarah nodded, thinking about Emily and wondering if her daughter's spirit had somehow guided Luna's choice to trust them. The interconnections felt too perfect for coincidence. A grieving mother finding purpose through protecting a bear family, a lonely widower discovering joy in surrogate grandparenthood, a guilt-ridden father learning redemption through service to the innocent. "The world needs Luna's story right now," Webb observed, watching the bus carrying the school children disappear into the distance. People are hungry for proof that love still matters, that sacrifice still means something, that families can heal even after terrible losses. As evening approached, Luna gathered her cubs for their nightly routine, the same comforting rituals that had sustained her family through separation, reunion, and recovery. Sarah, Frank, and Webb settled into their own evening pattern, three humans who had found their way back to hope through service to a remarkable bear who had taught them that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, it was about choosing to love again, despite the risks. The Amazon Research Station had become something far greater than its founders had ever imagined. Not just a place of scientific discovery, but a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever loved and lost, and wondered if their heart might still hold room for new beginnings. Luna's choice to stay, to trust, and to share her family with the world had created a legacy that would outlive them all, proof that love transcends species, that healing is always possible, and that sometimes the most broken people and animals can create the most beautiful families.